So you're all very welcome to week 5 of the Not About Being Good course. As I said to people who'd arrived, if you've just arrived, I've just been saying that there is a big retreat on this week, so we're going to be missing quite a few people who, many of whom have said to me that they'll catch up again using the video. So yeah, nice to be here with you for week 5. So what we're going to be doing tonight, let me just share the program. So hopefully you can see that. So we're going to do the usual review of last week in the home practice, how you got on. Let me just see. Oh yeah. So we're going to talk this week. The main theme is what happens when we fall short in our practice of the precepts. So you know, we've got all these very idealized aspirations for how we want to live our life. But you know, despite all our best intentions, we will fall short. We will, you know, get grumpy, unhappy, and so on with people. So what do we do then? And how do we feel then? How do we sort out how we feel? And we'll look at the healthy response and the unhealthy response. So a healthy response is to feel remorse, and an unhealthy response, an unhelpful response is guilt. So if other courses are anything to go by, we'll probably spend a good bit of time looking at the whole question of guilt and how to work with it. We'll touch into a few of these, like making amends, resolutions for the future, apologizing, confession and forgiveness. We won't probably go into any of those in great depth, but Subhadramati goes into them in more detail in her book. And we'll look then, just to finish on a positive vision of things, we'll look at the Buddha in all this and what the Buddha represents, yeah? So, and then we'll do the home practice as well, obviously. So just to remind you of what we did last week. Well, last week I did the review of previous week. I shouldn't really have left in that line, but anyways, last week we looked really at the mind precepts. So I'll remind us of what the mind precepts were in a few moments. And we looked at the whole question of commitment very briefly, but the other thing we looked at was ethical vigilance. So being very vigilant of, well, the word was apramada, it's like non-heedlessness. So being very careful to make sure that we're in good, that what we're doing is an ethical actions. Sorry, let me just change something here. Yeah, so that's what we were doing. Okay, and the home practice then was to read chapter 4 again. You know, that was the chapter we've been reading for a few weeks now on the ethical guidelines, the ethical precepts. And I was also encouraging you to read chapter 5, which is on commitment and vigilance, if you could. Look at your practice of the precepts over the coming week. That was one of your practices. Maybe even just pick one that's relevant and do the reflections on the precept every day. And I was also encouraging you to still keep up this practice of reflecting on 3 things you're grateful for each day and record them in your notebook. So that was in particular a response to the mind precept of covetousness versus tranquility. So when we can be appreciative of what we already have, it's a lot easier to experience tranquility, you could say, and record how you're getting on with all these in your notebook. Yeah. And in a few moments, we'll go into the small breakout rooms to talk about how you get on with that. But just to remind you of the mind precepts, well, firstly, there was the mind precept from the 5 precepts, which is avoiding intoxicants or practicing mindfulness. And then there was the 10 precepts of, you know, working with greed, hatred, and delusion. So working with covetousness and trying to practice tranquility, working with hatred and trying to practice compassion, and working with false views and trying to practice wisdom. Yeah. And we had a bit of a discussion as well around what views are. So that's covering what we did last week. So again, the home practice was reading, looking at your practice of the mind precepts in particular, doing some reflections, and then the gratitude journal. Yeah. So that's what the home practice was. So hopefully you had a good week of practice. Hopefully you're getting on top of the mind precepts and so on. So in a few moments, we'll go into the breakout room, but why don't we first of all, just set ourselves up, and as we've been doing these last few weeks, we'll do a short meditation just to help us arrive. And it might be that during that you also want to, you know, bring to mind how your week has gone so that you can bring that into the small groups. So I just ask you to make yourself comfortable, sit yourself reasonably upright, well supported by your chair or your cushions. When you're ready, closing your eyes, settling into your posture. Seeing what we can hear, well, listening rather to what we can hear, or allowing sounds to come to us from the world around us. Or dwelling in the silence if it's quiet. Tuning into what we can feel now in the body. Maybe starting with where we can feel our body, our skin, in touch with the floor, with the chair, with the cushions. Maybe seeing what we can feel in the legs, in the back, in the pelvis, in the spine, in the back, in the shoulders. What can we feel in our arms, in our hands and fingers? Becoming aware of what we can feel in our face, sides of our head, our jaw, our throat, our neck. Becoming aware of what we can feel in the stomach and the abdomen area. Resting in the heart area, in the chest. Staying with each inhalation, each exhalation. Drawing in energy with each inhalation. Letting go energy back into the world with each exhalation. And opening to a sense of all living beings, just like us, breathing in, breathing out. The whole world around us. Even plants breathe in and out in a way. The whole of life breathing just like us. Ethics is about connection with life. So opening to a relaxed connection with all life for these last few breaths. And then broadening out once more to take in the room around you, feeling the floor underneath your feet or the cushions, hearing the sounds again, bringing yourself back into your room that you're in. When you're ready, starting to bring the practice to a close. And then opening your eyes in your own time, coming out, making whatever movements you want to make. In your own time, reopening your eyes. Okay, so what we're going to do is go into groups now. So Tony is going to set us up with those. So there'll be groups of 4 and 5, I'd imagine. So it's an opportunity to talk about how you get on during the week, how you get on with your practice of the precepts, particularly how you get on with the mind precepts, you know, greed, hatred, and delusion. How did you get on with working with those? Hopefully you remember to do that. And also maybe what affected the gratitude journal, or working with the positives, tranquility, compassion, and wisdom, you could say. The other thing I didn't mention there in the earlier on is that, you know, I was saying about views. Did you start to notice what stories you tell yourself in your day justifying your behaviors? So that was a thing we talked about last week with views. So maybe you did that as well. You're ready to go, Tony? Yeah, okay, so hit the button and we'll see you in, so it'll be 12 minutes again. So once you're in the group, make sure that someone is the timekeeper and remember what group you're in case you drop out, and make sure everyone has a chance to speak, and we'll give you notifications maybe every 3 minutes. Yeah. So welcome back. I think that's everyone now. Do write any comments you want to make in the chat box, or any questions you want to put in, or any, you know, how you got on with the home practice as well. It'd be great to hear how you did. So Magella says it's lovely to talk to such positive people. That's great to hear, Magella. Yep. I'll just give it a second, and we can move on with the material then in a moment. I can see a few people typing, so I'll just give it a second. Great. Sam had a lovely chat with Paula, Laura and Carolina. Not a great week personally, but feeling the benefits of practice. That's good. Sorry to hear it wasn't a great week for of home practice, Sam, but that's good. Carolina is very happy to be joining all. Welcome, Carolina. Thanks for the comment earlier as well. Thank you. Julianne, fantastic to hear about other people's experiences. Valerie said, it's brilliant to realize how behaving differently brings amazing results. Who would have thought, huh? I mean, it's very simple, but we're so resistant to changing how we behave. We think the world should shape itself for us, you know? Barry said he really enjoyed, Mairead says it was a really positive group. Barry really enjoyed reading the book and writing in my gratitude journal, and it was lovely being in the breakout rooms. Orla, I found practicing generosity great, very gratifying, and wondering if you could explain why a nice Buddhist is a dead Buddhist in relation to this. So I don't mean that practicing generosity makes you a nice Buddhist. What I mean by nice Buddhist is someone who's nicey nice, but not really fully authentic, you know? So it's a superficial niceness, you could say. You know the difference when someone's like just being a bit superficial, when they're being nicey nice, rather than when they're being real. So I think you can be nice and real, but I would probably call that more, I don't know, warm and human or something like that. If someone is a bit superficial and not in touch with themselves at a deeper level, that's what I mean by the dead Buddhist, you know what I mean? And again, it's just a saying. So with every saying, I've heard it said that, you know, sayings like that are like firebrands. You know, you grab them and you wave them around the place, but they're not to be taken too literally, you know? A nice Buddhist isn't necessarily a dead Buddhist. It just depends what you mean by nice, you know? So if you're not nice, or you don't fall into the trap of being superficially nice, you don't need to worry about that statement. But for me, it spoke to me where I was at a few years ago, when I was more concerned with superficial harmony than depth of connection. So if you're more concerned about superficial harmony rather than depth of connection, then you're nice, you could say, in the negative sense of the word. Or I hope that answers your question, because I think generosity is very gratifying, and it is a very important core Buddhist practice, as I've said a few times before. Okay. Okay, you can keep your questions coming in if you want, or your comments. So what I wanted to look at this week is, so we've all been practicing the ethical guidelines now for a few weeks, for 2 weeks at least. We started looking at the 10 precepts 2 weeks ago, believe it or not. So hopefully you've been trying to live more according to those ethical guidelines. And the first thing that happens often when you start to try and live according to the ethical guidelines is that you notice just how much you don't live according to the ethical guidelines. Yeah. So you try and really take people in, you try and be really kind, you try and be really generous. And okay, yeah, definitely we succeed at times. And you also notice that you don't succeed at times as well. So, you know, you get annoyed with your friends, you get annoyed at your family, you get annoyed at your housemates, you don't feel particularly generous, you feel a bit rubbish, so you start getting into greed and overeating or over watching television or whatever it is you do. So, and then at some point, hopefully pretty quickly, you come back to awareness and you realize, I haven't lived up to what I've aspired to do this week, or what I've been aspiring to do because of Buddhism, because of the course, or what I'm aspiring to do because I want to live a Buddhist life. And especially when you start practicing the vigilance that we talked about last week, when you start being more vigilant about your mental states, you start to notice just that a bit of the time at least, if not a lot of the time, you are more in the grip of greed, hatred, and delusion than you are in the dwelling or swimming in contentment, compassion, and wisdom, you know? And that's fine. That's in a way, that's just what it means to be a human being a lot of the time. But particularly, I find particularly when I fall out with people, or when I get into hatred or ill will or something like that, or irritability, it's painful to feel like you've fallen short of what you aspire to. You know, it is painful to feel like, on the one hand, yeah, I want to be a kind, warm, generous person. And on the other hand, the reality of my experience right now is pretty far from that, yeah? So there's a painful dichotomy between those two. And that's what I want to focus on tonight. So let me just check something here. Let me just share the screen then, as usual with the notes. So let me just scroll through these. So this is painful. having shortcomings in our behavior is painful, and we want to be better. So that's just worth acknowledging and saying that our ethical shortcomings are painful. Yeah. And Buddhism talks about a helpful way of responding to this, or a helpful experience around this, and an unhelpful experience around this. So it talks about something called remorse. The word is Hri, the Sanskrit word, the Buddhist word. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. And this feeling of this gap between where you are now and your goals, or how you fall short of how you'd like to live, is called remorse. A feeling of regret, you could say. Regret is probably a good translation actually as well. So remorse or regret. And this remorse is actually a painful state of mind, but it's actually a positive state of mind. So we have been conditioned to think by evolution, by life, to think that if something is painful, it's bad. But actually, this is a mental state. This is a state of mind which is painful. So it's painful to feel like you haven't been as generous as you could be, or you got annoyed at people. But it's actually a positive state of mind in that it wants us, it helps us to do better next time. Yeah. And it's also positive because you experience it to the degree that you have developed an ethical sensibility. So if you hadn't come on this course and developed even further your ethical sensibility, everyone has an ethical sensibility, I believe. If you hadn't done that, you probably wouldn't feel it as painfully. Yeah. So the more ethically developed you are, the more you develop your ethical muscles, the more you commit yourself, the more vigilant you are ethically, the more painful it will be when you fall short of those ideals. So I just want to flag that now. So now would be the time to exit stage left, if that sounds like I'd rather wallow back in unawareness again. Yeah. And you might have seen this already. So a common experience, now it's a bit different in the lockdown, but I've noticed in previous courses where people have said, well, in the past, I'd be happy just to join in with the gossip and the backbiting and the bitching at work, but I just can't do that anymore now because it's just really painful to do. Actually, I feel it too keenly to join in again. Or sometimes what people say is, you know, I was looking at the meat on my plate and I thought, no, I can't do it anymore. You know, I can't eat this meat, so I'm going to become more vegetarian or more vegan. So you might have already noticed that as you practice more, you feel a keener sense of remorse when you're not living in tune with your ideals. The other response, which isn't a healthy one, I'll come back to the healthy remorse again in a few minutes. Yeah. The other response we can have is guilt. Now, guilt is unhelpful. Guilt is not healthy. It's painful and negative. Remorse is painful and skillful. It's healthy and painful. Guilt is just painful and unhelpful. So remorse helps us do better next time, whereas guilt helps us feel worse about ourselves next time. Yeah. So guilt is guilt, and there's a big difference. I can't emphasize this enough. There's a big difference between a healthy remorse on the one hand and guilt on the other. So let's just define what we mean by those. So by guilt, I mean a kind of some people would use the word guilt for remorse and mean it quite cleanly, but I'd like to use these terms in this way, where remorse is a kind of a healthy regret, a healthy remorse for something that we might have done, like maybe we snapped and shouted at someone or whatever. Guilt is is kind of more the neurotic, beating yourself up for not being a good person. Yeah. It's where you feel bad about yourself, and so you become unkind to yourself. Yeah. Yeah. And the sad thing about guilt is that you feel bad about something that you've done, and then you make it worse by punishing yourself for that, by being unkind to yourself as a result of your unkindness to someone else, perhaps, you know. And Subhadra Mati talks about this in her book a bit, where she talks about how one of the main reasons we do guilt is that we think that if we punish ourselves enough, other people won't then punish us. Yeah. And I don't know about you, but I've certainly noticed that tendency in myself at times when I've experienced guilt. I think, well, if I make myself miserable enough looking, the people who I've actually done wrong to will will kind of take pity on me and not give out to me then, you know, not berate me then. So I've certainly noticed that in the past. I think since becoming a Buddhist, I do guilt a lot less, but actually I feel remorse a lot more keenly. And that's what we're trying to aim for, that we do guilt less and we feel more keenly remorse. And I'll say more about why remorse is a good thing in a few minutes. So in terms of just a little bit more on guilt, and you can pop in your questions then in a minute about it. I'm sure there's thoughts sparked off by people. Sangharakshita talks about mechanisms of guilt, and he's the man who founded our community, and he talks about there's kind of three things that happen usually pretty quickly around guilt when guilt arises. Firstly, there's an awareness that you've done something wrong, yeah, and this might be something unskillful, but it might not be something unskillful. It might just be something that you know will be wrong in some people's eyes. Yeah, it might be something that other people just won't like. It might actually be skillful, but other people won't like it. But in any case, you're aware you've done something that's either wrong or someone might experience as wrong. So the whole mechanism of guilt is kicked off then. Then there's a fear of punishment when you're found out, or you fear being found out. You fear being punished if you are found out. Sorry, that's what I should have said. So there's a fear of punishment if you're found out or when you're found out. And this leads to the other thing about guilt is that it's a very secretive emotion. You tend to get into secrecy and concealment, because if people could only see what you've done, they would realize what a terrible person you are. Yeah. So we have this fear of punishment. And the third one then is the punishment itself. So that is the withdrawal of affection, the withdrawal of approval, the withdrawal of love from people you're dependent upon, people you're emotionally dependent upon, people you look up to. It might not be that they actively punish you, but you might experience the withdrawing of their affection or their love, and that will be punishment enough. So you're aware that you've done something wrong. You worry about punishment if you're found out or when you're found out, and then as a result, you're worried about the withdrawal of affection. And it's easy then for guilt to kind of spiral into a spiral of negativity, where you do something, you feel bad about it, and then you feel bad about feeling bad, and then you feel bad about that as well. And then it leaves you more cut off from other people, and you feel like a really bad person, and you feel like you're a burden on other people. And then you feel bad about that again, and so on. And guilt can be a negative spiral that just goes down and down and down. And I don't think I've ever suffered from depression in my life, but chatting to friends who have suffered from depression, I think this kind of ruminative thinking can play a large part in that as well, where you just can't get out of a cycle of negative thoughts around yourself. And a lot of that is guilt, I think, or it sounds like guilt anyway. But the important thing to say about, so that's the other thing then. So it really arises out of a feeling of having disobeyed an outside authority. And this outside authority can be like God, it can be society, it can be the voice in your head of authority, and so on. But in Buddhism is really clear that guilt is actually a negative state of mind, and it has no use. So guilt has no use in Buddhism. It's seen as a purely negative emotion, a purely unskillful emotion, and not something that we do. Yeah, and that might come as news to some people. That does come to news to some people. So I think the first thing to do with guilt, if you're in it, is recognize it as guilt and remember that Buddhism says there's no use for it. And again, you don't use that as a reason to then give yourself a hard time for feeling guilty and then feel guilty about feeling guilty because you shouldn't feel guilty. And so on. You know, I'm being slightly flippant, but that's what we can do as well. But so I really want to emphasize that there is no place for it in Buddhism. And a little voice in your head might go, yeah, but except for me. Yeah, it's best if I feel guilty. So watch out for that little voice that tells you that, no, I need to keep myself guilty. And sometimes maybe that's because guilt is familiar, or sometimes we fear what would happen if we didn't have guilt to keep us in check, and so on. But actually we have remorse so that we won't go completely megalomaniac. So we'll come back to remorse in a few moments. Yeah, that's just what I've said already. You feel bad So you try and make yourself feel worse by being unkind to yourself. So it might be a good point to stop and ask if there's any questions on guilt. Another thing just to say about guilt is that it probably arises for many of us out of our religious conditioning, or even out of our societal conditioning, even if we're not explicitly religious ourselves. A really good question to ask yourself is, have I broken a precept? Have I broken a precept here? So, and often when you ask yourself that, you know, have I taken the not given? Have I been unkind to someone? Have I caused harm in my sexual relationships? Have I spoken untruthfully, and so on? When you can tick those off, you realize, oh, I'm probably just worried about what people think of me. You know, it's not actually an ethical shortcoming. Or another thing you can do is talk with people. And, you know, a lot of the time in the order, you know, we have chapter meetings of order members every week. And sometimes you have to talk for a while before you can clarify if you have actually broken a precept, or if you're just feeling worried about not being liked, you know what I mean? So these are all ways, it is a practice to distinguish between remorse and guilt, healthy remorse and guilt. Okay, so some questions coming in. We can even feel guilty. Sometimes the more you practice study the ethical guidelines, you develop better tools for feeling bad about yourself as well, you know? And that's why it's important to keep the loving kindness practice going. If you know that meditation, it's important to do the gratitude journal to focus on the positive rather than the negative, and so on. So Sam asks, how does one distinguish guilt from remorse or regret? Is it to do with destructive self-criticism? Yeah, so it is. So I think so remorse and guilt have a tangibly different feel. So guilt is paralyzing. It tends to make you feel stuck. It tends to not make yourself feel better about yourself. It tends to, well, by contrast, remorse makes you want to do better next time. Yeah, guilt just makes you wallow in what you've already done. Remorse, in a healthy sense, is intrinsically forward-looking in a very positive sense of, okay, I'm going to make sure I don't let that happen again. Yeah, and we'll talk about the things that come out of remorse in a few minutes, like making amends, making resolutions for the future, possibly even apologizing, confessing, and so on. So regret, healthy regret, healthy remorse, is very much rooted or colored or flavored with a desire to do better next time, whereas guilt is not. It has a wallowing quality. Kasia is asking, is there a difference between guilt and shame in Buddhism? It depends what you mean by the word shame. So if you use the word shame in an Eastern context, it's probably closer to what we would call healthy remorse. So tends to be more of a shame culture in the East. They don't tend to have the same kind of guilt culture that we have in the West. There's a story, I don't know where it's from, but of the Dalai Lama coming to the West one of his first times, and he had to have the idea of low self-esteem explained to him. He couldn't understand it. It wasn't something that Tibetans did, for example. So I think low self-esteem is often tied up in guilt as well. But I think in the West, when we talk about shame, we probably tend to mean it linguistically in the more negative sense of guilt. That's just my connotations of it. So what I would encourage you to do is just try and keep to the Buddhist words if you can, like Hri and Apatrāpya, which we'll come on to in a minute. Or yeah, so someone else says there that there is a tangible and toxic culture of shame pervading the West, or shaming. And, you know, there is a dark side to some of modern trends, like the darker side of identity politics and so on, which involves shaming as well. So I wonder if we would be better off avoiding the word shame, actually, or moving away from it. I think it is pretty much bound up in similar feelings to guilt. But just to highlight that in the East, it might not mean that, yeah. Carolina says remorse is short. Well, remorse tends to be short in the sense that it has an imperative to action within it to bring you beyond it, yeah? Whereas guilt doesn't have that imperative to action. Guilt is paralyzing, as I've said. And again, I really encourage you to ask yourself the question, what have I actually done here? Have I actually broken a precept here? That is a really good question to ask yourself. Or am I just feeling bad about myself? Am I just worried what people will think? Yeah. And you might actually need to remind yourself that it isn't about being popular. It's about living in tune with your ideals. And actually living in tune with your ideals might actually make you unpopular. Becoming more and more of an individual might actually make you unpopular at times. Let's say you decide not to join in anymore with the office politics and the office gossip. That might make you less popular. People might not want to talk to you as much. You know what I mean? So it would be easy to get into feelings of guilt, like you've offended people, or they'll withdraw their approval from you, which is more about guilt than shame. Great. And Paula says, quotes, when you know better, you do better. Yeah, so that is kind of the flavor of remorse. So I hope part of the homework this week is to look at what happens when you do fall short. Are you able to move into a healthy sense of remorse, or do you tend to get diverted into guilt? And I think guilt is very pervasive, sadly, in our culture. It's tied up with all kinds of things and sin. And yeah, we can even become really bad Buddhists. And I don't mean that in a good way. You know, we can feel like, oh God, if the guys on the course only knew just how bad a person I was, they wouldn't like me. You know what I mean? That is probably a version of guilt as well. Yeah. Okay, I hope that's clear. I'll keep going, but do send in your questions if you have any more about that. I mean, I have to say, it's not something I feel hugely, it's not something I do hugely much anymore. So I do think that it does become clear from practice. It does clear up a bit from practice in the Metta Bhavana and so on. But it might be complex. You know, for some people, there is a lot of stuff that will need to be unfolded, but there is no reason there's no reason to give yourself a hard time. There's no reason to be unkind to yourself in Buddhism. There's absolutely no reason for it. There's no justification whatsoever. Yeah. So in terms of the more skillful mental states, the two words in Buddhism are Hri and Apatrāpya. So these are both kind of flavors or aspects of what we could call remorse. So Hri is our own internal conscience. Yeah, it's our natural internal response to falling short and wishing we could have done better. Yeah, so you could say that's our internal conscience. It's our own sense of where we might have fallen short and how we could have done better in situations. And just to flag as well, by the way, that we don't need to go looking for these all the time. We will have times where we feel very happy. We have that freedom from remorse that I talked about in week 2, called pamoja, you know, a feeling of delight and joy. And if you want to, I mean, Subhadramati talks about, you know, if you don't feel you've done anything wrong, then don't feel bad. You know, don't go looking for remorse. You know, just enjoy the feelings of freedom from remorse. You know, but anyways, Hri we've kind of covered. It's a bit more straightforward. It's our own internal one. The other one, which requires a bit more explanation, is Apatrāpya. So how this is translated is respect for wise opinion. So this is where it's a bit difficult to describe, but it's not to do with seeking approval from other people. It's more that being around people you admire or thinking of people you admire, you don't want to be seen as being unskillful. Yeah, you don't want to take a course of action which they wouldn't do. Yeah. You know, so you might think about bringing an ethical conundrum to a friend that you admire and look up to, and well, what would be their response? What would they do? Yeah, I remember way back when I was first getting into meditation and Buddhism, I was an avid hiker and mountaineer, and I was wondering whether I could, you know, get a discount in one of the shops that I wasn't really entitled to be honest, by using someone else's membership card of, I think it was the Irish Mountaineering Council or something like this. And I chatted to a Buddhist friend, and he said, well, you know, in a way you can do whatever you want. I mean, it's just a matter of what are you trying to do with your life? Are you trying to get nice clothes? Are you trying to get enlightenment? You know, and you know, with that, I knew what I had to do. That was a kind of a feeling of apatrāpya. You know, it wasn't that he was criticizing me or anything. He was just laying it out as it was, and I thought, no, I have to do the right thing here. You know, particularly because I've shared it with this person who I look up to. Another question you might ask yourself is, would I want to share what I'm doing with that person I admire on the spiritual path, or would I like to bring it to my discussion group here on the course? And what do I really want to do this thing that I'll have to talk about then on my reporting in group on the course, you know? Another example, which I think is a very good example for me, was a very good example for me of this was, I remember walking with the man who ordained me, Kulananda, around Cambridge where he lived. And there's all these lovely parks in Cambridge, some of them private. He was wondering if we could get through a private park as a shortcut to get where we wanted to go. And one of the residents who were living in the park happily put the code into the gate to open the gate. It was an electronic keypad. And as I was walking by, I kind of whispered to Kulananda, we should remember the code so we can come back again, you know? And Kulananda just thought about it for a second. He goes, yeah, but it would kind of be taking the not given, wouldn't it, you know? And he wasn't saying it in any judgmental way or anything, but in myself, I felt about that big ethically, you know? I felt like, God, I didn't even think about the fact that it would be taking the not given. And I just had a huge, tremendous respect for Kulananda and how well developed his ethical practice was. And he didn't set out to make me feel bad or anything like that, but I just thought, God, I really have to do better here, you know? And that for me was a really good example of what apatrāpya is. It's kind of other people bringing out the best in you, you know, because you admire people very well, you just want to do better. You don't want to be seen in that way. They're like an externalized conscience, you could say. So Hri is our own conscience, and Apatrāpya is our externalized conscience that we have. Yeah. So I hope that's clear. Do put in any questions that you have. And another Buddhist teacher talks about how, in a way, they're both very necessary, but Apatrāpya is probably more necessary because we find it very easy to overpower our own sense of conscience. Yeah, it's very easy, particularly when things are challenging, to say, no, I deserve this, or no, my anger was justified, to ourselves. But it's a lot more difficult to rationalize that in relation to other people. If you have to come here next week and talk about, you know, in this breakout rooms, how you were mean to someone, you're much less likely to do it if you know you're going to have to come here and say it to people than if you have to live with it yourself, if you see what I mean. And this highlights, I think, the importance of spiritual friendship, so that we have friends around us who can be that ethical support to us, you know. That's why the spiritual community, one of the reasons why the spiritual community is so important. Okay, I've talked a lot there. There's one or two more things I could say, but let's see if there's any questions or comments on that. Does that make sense? Hopefully it doesn't feel too much like confession in the church when you're a kid. I'll talk a bit more about that if you grew up in Ireland anyway. We're not talking about feeling bad about yourself. We're just more talking about a natural response to when we feel, because we've been working to clarify our ideals and how we really want to live, we'll feel more keenly when we're not like that. Yeah. And I guess if we're in a negative state of mind, if we're in aversion, if we're in ill will to people, I think the first thing we have to realize as well is that this isn't good enough. This isn't our ideal. Okay, maybe they have to change their behavior, but if we're annoyed with people, then we have to work with our annoyance. Yeah, we have to work with our annoyance. Buddhism is really completely clear about that. If it's a negative state of mind, we need to work with that, you know? Yeah, so Sam makes a good point that part of my falling short this week came from forgetting how much there seems to be to remember. And perhaps it's worth learning off the precepts. So, and because he's making the point that on the meditation course, I urge people to learn off the hindrances to be good meditators. So if you want to be a good Buddhist, well, good, you know, good is a problematic word, but you know what I mean? If you want to be an effective Buddhist, yeah, learn off the precepts. learn them off. Chant them every day. Buddhists chant the 5 precepts every day usually to remind you of how to live. And another thing about forgetfulness is that a large part of mindfulness, so we're mindful so that we can be vigilant, a large part of mindfulness, and even the word itself, sati or smrti, comes from the word recollect, to remember, to be mindful, to remember to be ethical. So the largest part of ethical practice is remembering to be ethical. Yeah. So Buddhism then does Buddhism then not include the concept of self-worth or self-esteem, Tony asks. I'm not sure what you mean by that, Tony. You might have to say a little more how it doesn't. I think our self-worth comes from living in tune with our ideals. So the more in tune we can be with our ideals, the more we have this freedom from remorse, the happier we will be, the more self-worth we will have. And acknowledging our own shortcomings won't necessarily mean that we have to compromise our sense of self-worth. I think like Hri and Apatrāpya come from a sense of self-worth, come from a sense of feeling like, no, it's possible to live ethically, it's possible to live well, and here's where I've fallen short on that. So do pop in any other questions as well if you want. Or if you're having any crazy reactions to anything I've said, you can pop that in as well. Okay, why don't we, on that note, let's just see what the timing is. Why don't we take a 5-minute break now after all that quite heavy material? And why don't we come back at 8:10 ready to go, and we'll look at some implications or some actions that we can do that might come out of remorse, like making amends, resolutions, apologizing, and confession, and so on. And we'll finish by looking at the Buddha then as well. Okay, so a 5-minute break, back ready to go at 8:10. Thank you. And in the meantime, you can always write any questions you have in the chat box. Let's just see if people are back. Okay, it looks like people are back, which is great. Okay, just to, let me just share the screen. Just to remind you while we're just now that you can see our events on our website, dublinbuddhistcentre.org/online. It's not too late to sign up for our summer retreat if you want to join in. We have meditations every morning at 7, meditation teaching at 8 if you know how to meditate already. There's beginners meditation teaching each morning as well. And even if you can only do the morning, there's some really good teaching going on at 8 o'clock, for example, on the Metta Bhavana. Every evening from 7 to 9, there's a Buddhism talk with meditation and some chanting. There's events during the day as well. And even if you can only make one event a day, you're still very welcome to sign up for that. It'll be going on until next Sunday morning. And you can find that on our website, dublinbuddhistcentre.org. And we'll also, in the next wee while, be advertising our next courses and so on too. The other thing is just to remind you that we're not charging for this course. So we're almost entirely dependent upon donations. So if you can give a donation to help support the centre, that would be really, really welcome. I think Tony's just put the links in. Thanks, Tony. That's great. So if you can do that, that would be great. dublinbuddhistcentre.org/donate or paypal.me/dublinbuddhistcentre is a really quick way to give. Yeah, and if you can give a donation, we'd really love if you could. We'd really ask you if you could give a donation for the course. You know, if we're doing the course in the centre, we'd probably be asking you for money, like I think it's 150 euros or something like that, or 120 euros rather. Now, obviously this is a very different course, but if you can give something, that would be much appreciated. You can give as much or as little as you want, and if you're not in a position to give, that's completely fine too. Is there any other things to announce? No, I think that's enough for now. A few more comments in the chat box. So Laura has a really interesting one. She says, "I'd feel like guilt is felt even at times when remorse is not warranted, or guilt is not warranted, like a default state. Yes, that does make sense. So she apologizes a lot when she's in conversation, and or takes on work in case her boss thinks she's lazy or something, or having a DOS. So I think that that's a really good point, which I probably should have brought out earlier, that we can feel guilt even when we've done nothing wrong. Yeah, we can feel guilt even when we've done nothing wrong. And a big one is not feeling like we're working hard enough. Yeah. And Sam makes the point, maybe it's part of our inherited Catholic guilt, which is probably right. Julianne asks, so sorry, Laura, I guess the thing is just to, maybe you need to just take on a principle of not saying sorry in conversation tomorrow, and then do that the next day as well, and then do that the next day as well, until you get into the habit of just not saying sorry. And your communication might feel a bit clunky at first, but hopefully over time you get out of that habit. And if you do it in small ways like that, it will manifest more widely as well. And you might even need to, dare I say it, blaspheme against yourself. You know what I mean? You know, kind of like, well, I'm definitely not going to say sorry now. You know what I mean? You can treat it playfully. You know what I mean? But there's no reason to, I've seen that behavior in people. I've seen it myself. And I don't think it's something that anyone enjoys, really. You know what I mean? Whether you're the apologizer or the apologizee, if that's the word. Do you know what I mean? So just decide, just make a decision tomorrow not to do it. Yeah. And just see if you can do it for one conversation, and then see if you can do it for 2 conversations, and so on. That's the kind of strategies that you need with guilt, I think, like this, you know, habitual guilt. Julianne, is it possible to transform guilt into remorse if you catch yourself doing guilt and know that it's unhelpful? You can, Julianne, and I think Julianne, but I think you can. And one way that you can do it is by just asking yourself, what is the precept I've broken here? And you might just say, okay, well, I've done this. Like the process is, okay, so I've done this. It's not in line with the ethical guidelines. I'm going to try not to do that next time. I'm going to look at the conditions that led to it and make sure they don't happen again. And I'm going to go out now and make amends, or I'm going to work really hard at not doing that again. I've done it. I'm going to accept that I've done it, and I'm going to be merciful to myself. And I think a lot of it does come back to your views. So I talked about views last week. I think with guilt, there's an underlying view that you need to punish yourself. You need to do this guilt to yourself. So just challenge that view. That is a wrong view. There's no accepting of that in Buddhism. Carolina brings a Polish perspective. She says that Irish people do say sorry a lot. That is true. So, and Polish people, however, never do. So, yeah, that's really interesting. Valerie says, that I do things for sheer pleasure and enjoyment, but that it can go against avoiding intoxicants precept, like just enjoying a tasty coffee. Yeah, no, I think there's nothing wrong with enjoying a tasty coffee. There's nothing wrong with enjoying the pleasure of things. There's nothing wrong with sitting out in the sun this afternoon and really enjoying it. There's nothing wrong with really enjoying seeing our friends. Where it becomes an intoxicant is if we're kind of getting very graspy around it, if we're getting intoxicated with it, if we're losing our mindfulness around it, if we're using it as a way of getting away from something internally. You know what I mean? That's where it becomes an intoxicant. So 2 people might be doing exactly the same thing from the outside. One of them, it's an intoxicant. For the other one, it's a really healthy pleasure. But you can't tell the difference because it comes back to their internal motivation, just like with all Buddhist ethics. Yeah. So I really don't want you to think that you can't enjoy pleasurable things. The Buddha encouraged pleasure, but what he did say was, where we think pleasure lies is probably quite different to where it actually is. So real pleasure comes from spiritual practice, from generosity, from connection with friends, from connection with life, from giving, from living simply, and so on, not having stuff. Even if you just take that one, living simply, we all agree with that, I'm sure, and yet we end up on Amazon again and again buying stuff, you know? So it's noticing where true pleasure lies. That's what the skill is. And Dominica, who I'm guessing is not Irish as well, completely agrees with Carolina. Yeah. So I'm sorry about that, Dominica. Okay, I apologize on behalf of all Irish people. Okay, so let's keep going. So if you have more questions, do send them in. So how are we doing time? Was it 20 past 8? So we'll do a bit more on this, and then I'm keen to do a bit of a longer, about 5-10 minute reflection at the end as well. So let's reflecting on the Buddha. Okay, so the other thing then to talk about is, and I don't think I have I got notes for this? Let me just check. Oh yeah. Okay, so I think I'll just talk about it without notes. So the other thing about Hri is that it'll help us to want to put things right, yeah, or stop things happening again. So when we're in a healthy sense of remorse, we'll probably start to say, God, what happened there? How did I get into that state of mind? And how can I prevent it happening again? So we might make resolutions so that we can keep our mindfulness and our ethical vigilance going. So an example for this for me was that one of the things that my partner and I noticed, that if either of us were away on retreat, the day that we come back from the retreats, if we met up that day, that evening, we'd often have an argument. And I think it was because when you get on retreat, you become very inward focused, and you become very content and kind of content within yourself. And then what was happening was the other person, be it me or be it her, were feeling like we weren't being taken in fully, maybe because the person was there in this kind of slightly blissful, dreamy state that you can sometimes end up in after retreats, you know. And so we ended up having an argument. So what we did for quite a while was we just decided not to meet up the night of the retreat ending, and we'd meet up the next morning instead. And then that was fine. And and nowadays we're much better at it, so we can meet whenever, and there's no arguments. Or maybe you know that if you meet a person in a pub and you have a drink with them, you'll end up getting into an argument with them. I said this one of the previous weeks. You meet up in a cafe for coffee instead, you know. So resolutions like that can be good. Not letting yourself get to the point where you lose your mindfulness. That's what a resolution is, really. Not letting yourself get to a point where you lose mindfulness. You also might want to make apologies. So an apology is a genuine, heartfelt sense of, well, a genuine apologizing, a genuine expression of sorrow for how you've behaved. Yeah. And ideally, it's unqualified. You have to watch out for passive aggressive apologies. I'm sorry, right? You know, or you have to watch out for explaining it away. You know, I'm sorry, it happened because of this, this, and this, and this, and this. Or you have to watch out for non-apologies, which are like, I'm sorry if you feel offended, you know, which isn't really an apology at all. Sorry. You also have to watch out for strategic apologies, I think. So if you apologize for this, they'll apologize, this small thing, they'll apologize for that much bigger thing that you want them to apologize for, you know? So watch out for that kind of strategic apologizing, where your only real motivation for apologizing is to get them to apologize. Yeah. So watch out for that kind of thing as well. I think ideally an apology should be quite genuine. Yeah. And it might be that so that you have to make amends as well. You have to put right what you did wrong. So maybe you did something wrong and they got annoyed with you, and then you got annoyed at them, and so you apologize. But you also might have to make right what you put wrong as well. Or maybe you caused damage in your unskillfulness. Maybe you went and slandered someone, and then you felt bad about it afterwards. But maybe then, you know, so you can apologize to the person, but maybe you also have to go to the other person that you talked about that. Go to the person you talked about the other person with and say, actually, that wasn't quite correct. You know, that would be making amends, for example, and so on. Yeah, so that's making amends, resolutions, apologizing. So they're all important too. And another way of knowing the difference between guilt and healthy remorse is that you will want to do those things. Yeah, you will want to make amends. You will want to not let it happen again. You will want to, or maybe not want to, but you will certainly probably see the need for those things and the need for an apology perhaps as well. So Sam points out that, you know, that's what I said, they're not letting yourself get to the point where you lose mindfulness. That's also about enjoying pleasures. Yeah. So a pleasure becomes enjoyable until it becomes an intoxicant, I guess. And Orla asks, is it always important to make amends? I think it is important to make amends if it's possible. And I can't say I always do. Sometimes I feel the price is too high and I'm not quite ready, but that's more about my own failings than spiritual guidance, you could say. And sometimes it's not possible to make amends, or sometimes it's not necessary to make amends. You know what I mean? Sometimes an apology is enough. An apology is the amends, you could say. Yeah. Yeah, I hope I've answered that. The other thing then that we could do, this is a bit more controversial, and I won't spend too long on this, is we might feel an urgent need to confess. Yeah. So I don't know about many of you, but I'm sure like many of you, I was brought up a Catholic in Ireland in the countryside. And confession for many years for me was about going into a dark wooden box and confessing the same old sins again and again to a priest. And, you know, being told how I'd make baby Jesus cry, or, you know, my soul would get stained and I could go to hell. And my sins were usually the same every time. They were being mean to my siblings, not showing respect to my parents, lying, stealing. And if I had any really bad ones, I wouldn't mention those in case you got in real trouble, you know. I wouldn't mention those at all. And also, it seemed to me like the trick was to, if you were going to die, just make sure you confess just before you die, and then you'll be fine anyway, you know. So what I had there was a very legalistic approach to confession. So that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about confession in Buddhism. You'll be happy to hear, because to be frank, it didn't really have much of an effect on me, in a positive sense at least. I just got very legalistic about it, and it didn't really stop me from doing all those things that I just kept doing anyway, you know. And that was, you know, how I related to it. I'm sure there's people for whom it's a very genuine experience, but for me it wasn't. And I know many people who that kind of experience was very damaging as well. I was chatting to a friend a few years ago about he was training to be a priest, and he was also, like, the confessional was a torturous, traumatic process for him, particularly because of his sexual orientation. And so for many people, that experience can be very traumatizing, actually. So we're not talking about that when we talk about confession, because there's no sin in Buddhism, there's no guilt in Buddhism. Confession's more about recognizing that we have deeper patterns that are unhelpful to us and needing to be able to talk about those with other people. Yeah, that's what confession's about. It's about recognizing these deeper negative patterns in ourselves that we need to bring out and talk to other people about. So, for example, sorry, Magella's comment is really good. I used to feel guilty if I hadn't sinned. I used to actually make them up. Yeah, that's a good one too, yeah. So you'd feel guilty about not having things to confess. Anyways, so in terms of healthy confession, so every week, usually all the different order members in our community get together, and I meet with a bunch of other people, around 5 or 6 of us, and we have a bit of a reporting in, and we also talk then about anything that where we feel like we've fallen short of our ideals, anywhere we're feeling remorse or regret. And there's something about saying to other people who are on the path with me in a confessional context that gives it a real weight, a very positive weight, and makes me really not want to do it again, actually. So that's, I think, where confession can be really useful. It's just about being able to share with someone, unburden ourselves, unburden our conscience, so that we can come back to a clean and healthy conscience again. There's something about that that's very, very useful. The thing is, you need very kind of particular conditions to do that. So Bhadramati does outline them in her book. On page 112, she's a whole list of things that you need for confession. But I have to say, it's not necessarily something that I would be urging you to do unless you're quite clear about the difference between guilt and remorse. And I would be very careful about your previous conditioning if you were brought up a Christian or a Catholic. And you also need to pick people that are good to confess with. So imagine if you said, you turned around to a friend and you were saying this really deep thing that, you know, you just really wanted to talk about how you're compulsively doing this behavior and you can't get beyond it. And then they say to you, you're grand, don't worry about it. You know, that would be really painful. So you need people to confess to who understand the context of why you're trying to work with these deeper patterns. And if you don't have that, it's probably better not to try and engage in confession. But again, that's one of the things that a spiritual community is really good for. It gives you people that you can kind of talk about this with. And even if you don't do formal confession with all its ins and outs, you can have a kind of a confessional tone at times. You might say to someone, look, I did something there earlier. I was really aggressive with someone in the shop when I was out doing my shopping, and I just really want to say it to you to kind of get it off my chest. That's a confessional act, you know, and that can be really useful. And it can help you also feel that apatrāpya that I talked about earlier, the sense of, you know, I really feel like I want to do better, and I want to be a better person in other people's eyes as well, you know, in a healthy way. And then the other thing to do after confession is just to get back in touch with your inspiration as quickly as you can. Don't wallow in guilt or anything like that. Just try and get inspired, which is why we're going to look at the Buddha in a few minutes as well. I guess the main spark for remorse and regret is probably realizing that our actions have consequences. Yeah, our actions will have consequences on other people. Our actions will have consequences on ourselves. Our actions shape our character. As we think and act, so we become. It's an apocryphal saying by the Buddha. As we think, so we become. I haven't been able to trace it down in that format, but I think it's a very, very good saying. So do we want to become someone who's dominated by irritability? Do we want to become more and more a person who is a cranky old fella, or who, you know, as you get older and older, do you really want to work with those repeated small nagging negativities, or do you just want to be free of them? Yeah, so our actions have consequences both for ourselves and for others, and if you can see that it affects other people in particular, I think we'll feel a keener sense of healthy remorse and not want to do it again. Yeah, so remorse, Hri and Apatrāpya, they're the guardians of the spiritual life. They help us to really try and do better next time. The last thing just to touch on, I'm worried I'm giving you too much information, but we'll just touch on this last point, then I'll stop. The last thing is about forgiveness. So this is something Subhadramati talks about in her book as well. She talks about how forgiveness is a spiritual death experience. It's a letting go of, what's the word, grievance. It's a letting go of grievance. It's a letting go of that feeling of they've wronged me, they've done me wrong. And so it's a real spiritual death experience. It's a letting go of a kind of an identity we have around how we've been wronged. And that takes real strength, actually. I remember not understanding forgiveness for years. I remember those of you who were like me and grew up in the 80s, I think it was, will remember Gordon Wilson. He was in Ireland anyway, you might remember him. So he was, there was a bomb that went off by the IRA in Enniskillen and killed many people. And he was, if I'm remembering correctly, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but his daughter was buried in rubble. And I think he was buried in the rubble as well. And he was talking to her as she died. And he talked about this very, very movingly. I think it was on BBC or one of some national press, national television. And he was very clear immediately that he didn't bear any ill will whatsoever to the people who'd planted the bomb, and he completely forgave them for their actions. And people, I was reading about it earlier today, and again, just to refresh my memory on it, and people were reckoning that it was one of the turning points in the Troubles. People were so moved by the strength of what he said, it was a major turning point in the Troubles. Well, that in itself shows the power of forgiveness, actually. But I remember at the time thinking, I wouldn't be able to do that. And I didn't even understand why one would do that. Yeah, I didn't even understand why one would want to forgive someone who did, the people who did that horrible deed, you know? So it's very impressive. And if he can do it in that situation, perhaps we can do it with our own, our own petty grievances when someone doesn't do the washing up, or, the driver in front of us doesn't quite yield as quickly as we'd like them to when we're driving to town, or whatever it is, So it is a real letting go. And it's worth asking yourself the question, why should we forgive? Why should we forgive someone who's done us wrong? And maybe you want to share your comments in the chat about why one should forgive. That would be interesting to hear, actually. Maybe while you're doing that, I'll just read out a quote from the Dhammapada. It said, "We are all heading for death. Those who realize this will compose their quarrels." We are all heading for death. Those who realize this will compose their quarrels. So why forgive? So I'm just going to give it a minute or two, just so I cannot be talking all the time, and just to give you a chance to chat or comment in the chat box. So why forgive? Great. So good ones to come in here. Good ones coming in here. So Barry says that he forgave a friend today and it felt very good afterwards. It would be great, Barry, if you fancied saying what good means, but I'd imagine you felt probably lighter, more happy to move on, more connected, and so on. Laura says to feel at peace, yeah, because yeah, it creates a lot of hostility to bear grudges and so on. Magella echoed what the Dhammapada said, life is so short, it's only as we get older that we realize. That's very, very true. That's why the Dhammapada says, if you can really reflect upon the fact that you're heading to death, these little difficulties and disagreements will feel so petty, so petty. Paula talks about how it's easier to forgive than to carry hate in your heart. It is easier. It might not feel like that, but it is easier. Sam says to let go of one's resentment, yeah, and to release the perpetrator from their own suffering, yeah. There, but for the grace of God, go I, exactly. Leah says, forgiveness is the fragrance the violent sheds on the heel that has crushed it. Sounds like a Rumi poet quote that, but that's a lovely quote, yeah. To feel forgiveness is to soften your heart rather than to contract. It's in your own self-interest. Yeah, that's very true, Orla. Kasia says to cultivate compassion, understanding of our shared humanity. We all make mistakes. Yeah, we all make mistakes. And to understand, isn't that the saying to, I can't remember what it is, to err is human, to forgive divine. I don't think that's quite related to what you said, but it is just realizing that we all make mistakes. To let go of blocking resentful energy. Valerie says, forgiving to me means no longer carrying the energetic imprint of the anger. Yeah, it's helping us and also the person to face their actions. Yeah, so forgiveness can be a powerful tonic for difficulties with people. In the Buddhist tradition, it's said that seeking revenge is like trying to harm someone else by drinking poison yourself. Yeah, so seeking revenge is like trying to harm someone else by drinking poison yourself. So it's quite a strong saying that. It's like drinking poison to stop. It's like drinking poison, trying to seek revenge is like trying to harm someone else by drinking poison yourself. Daria says it feels like you're not carrying the burden, and if you do not forgive, it'll keep taking from you energy. Yeah, it keeps energy to keep that kind of stuff in there and keep it going. It can be acknowledgement of how we change and evolve. Yeah, and at the time, yeah. Thanks for that, Daria. That's very true. Barry says the love and kindness filled up inside me. I was asking Barry to clarify what he meant by good. and there's no point in holding on to any ill will. Yeah, that's great. Spout the love and kindness out into the world. So it's very good. I think we can all acknowledge the importance of forgiveness, but doing it then is the challenge, isn't it? So that's what you'll need to do. I mean, we can't force forgiveness, and sometimes there is a real process around it, and we might need to work through blame and anger. Anger is often called a covering emotion, so it covers up for a deeper hurt, actually. So I think sometimes the path to forgiveness is just feeling the deeper hurt that's there, and asking yourselves, what would it be like to let go of this pain? But and forgiveness, people think that can think that forgiveness will make you vulnerable, but actually, I think forgiveness is usually a hallmark of a strong person. It's usually the stronger person that forgives, in my mind. So bearing that in mind. And also we might need to forgive ourselves for things that we've done, for being an imperfect being. I think a lot of our guilt comes out of the feeling that we should be perfect immediately. So maybe we need to forgive ourselves for being imperfect. And maybe that comes into your loving kindness practice as well, yeah? Okay. Just a question from earlier that someone sent me. Making amends. What about a scenario where apologizing is likely to cause more suffering on both sides, opening up the old wound and damaging the reputation if it's spread around? Yeah, I mean, you just have, like, again, with all this stuff, you have to work out the best thing, and the guiding principle is kindness and appropriateness. So you just have to, like, Buddhism offers you these principles, and you have to apply them yourself in the best way you can. And I'm reminded of something that a friend of mine who's a parent said to me. He said, in a way, it's impossible to be a perfect parent. What you're aiming for is being good enough, yeah? And in a way, it's impossible to be a perfect Buddhist. What we're aiming for here, well, it's not impossible because we can become Buddhas, but for now, we're just trying to be good enough, yeah? Or skilled as we, do the best we can, yeah? Do the best we can. Okay, so I feel like I've talked for way too much. So let me just move on here. So what we're going to do next is I said that after we confess, but also after we make amends and after we forgive and all that, we need to put ourselves back in tune with our inspiration. So I want to spend a few minutes just in a silent reflection, you could say. So hopefully you can all see your screens, because I'm going to share an image. And I just want us, the reflection is a non-verbal reflection, a non-cognitive reflection in some ways. And we're just going to look at the Buddha, and we're just going to take in the Buddha. So the Buddha is an exemplar, is an embodiment of what it would be like to live completely free of greed, hatred, and delusion. He shows what it would be like to be completely free of the negative states of mind and just dwell in the positive states of mind all the time. He says very clearly in his teachings that it is possible to move to a state where you're no longer unskillful in any situation. You're perfectly mindful. And he attained it, and many, many other people down through the ages apparently have attained it. So it is possible. So he represents what it would be like never to always feel perfect equanimity, to never be thrown off balance, or never to feel stressed, to never respond with any kind of sticky self-obsessedness, and to always be kind and appropriate. So we can bring the Buddha to mind. So we're going to do that for the next few minutes. I'm just going to share this. Can I just check that you can see that? Tony, can you unmute yourself and tell me that you can see that okay?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, because I don't think, and can you see the little box of people in the side?
What do you mean by that?
You know the way you can see the little box of people when the screen is shared? Can you see that at the moment?
Yeah. I can see the summaries of people's images and videos.
Yeah, so if you want to, I think one of the buttons at the top will minimize that. So I'd like your screen to be as clean as possible if you can do that. Not just Tony, I mean everyone now. So ideally you're just looking at the image of the Buddha, and you can just see that. So maybe, click around and see what you can do to make it more clean. So what we'll do for the next 8 or 9 minutes is I'm just going to be quiet, and we're just going to look at the Buddha and see. You don't have to do anything apart from that. Not even look at the Buddha, just let in the Buddha, let in the image of the Buddha, and what does it communicate to you? Remembering that the Buddha represents you and your potential as well, and what you can achieve. Okay, so I'm going to mute myself now and I'll chat to you in a few minutes and we can check in about that then. Okay, and I'll bringing that reflection to a close now. I'm just going to stop the screen sharing. Okay, it'd be quite interesting to hear if you had any responses there to the image or what effect it had on you. It's funny, I was watching it and or looking at the Buddha, and I started experiencing feelings of grief actually coming up. I'm not sure what that was. It's kind of like, how would I describe it? I don't know, I just started, some part of me relaxed a bit and something else came up, and then it passed through, and then I felt quite well, or at least a kind of somber well, you know. So, but it was a positive state. I think I started becoming aware of my shortcomings, maybe a little bit. But I think it's important to connect with the Buddha, or at least your ideal. Get back in touch with the positive. And in some practices, you recollect the Buddha, and it's said he's delighted to see you, and he has an atmosphere or a feeling of complete kindness and welcoming as well. And it'd be interesting if you wanted to type in how you found it. I've not tried that reflection online before. But the point anyway is that we really do need, if we experience remorse, if we experience Hri or Apatrāpya, we do, as well as make amends and so on, we reconnect with our inspiration again. And often our inspiration will come from reading a book about Buddhism, maybe rereading some of Sabhadramati, meeting a good friend, being able to have a good connection with people, experiencing beauty again, like in nature, those kinds of things, and also reconnecting, reflecting upon our ideals. And the Buddha represents your potential for enlightenment. That's you there at the end of your spiritual journey. You can, there's various other Buddhist forms. So that was the historical Buddha. You can see here behind me, there's a female figure called Tara, who's also said she's more of an archetypal figure that people bring to mind. And she represents wisdom in particular. But there's lots of different ways of connecting with the ideal. So Orla said compassion, common humanity, wholeness, connection, love. Daria said that she felt a strong connection and tapping into calmness and expansion. Yeah, so that's exactly the kind of thing I mean in terms of reconnecting with the positive. So, and again, that will stop us getting into guilt, I think. Sam said he first felt envy and desire for enlightenment, then admiration. And the words that sprang to mind were universality and resilience. Is that image available anywhere? Yeah, so the image, I can't give it to you because it's been used, it's from a retreat center and they've lent it to us for use in these contexts, but you can buy it. Tony, would you be able to look up the image on Papaloka and send it to people in the chat? And I'll try and remember to send it. Maybe you could send it to me in the Slack channel as well, and I'll include it in the email if you want to get it. Let's see, sorry, what else? Yeah, Valerie said, it was like I could see his eyes open and then close. Yeah, they look kind of open and they look kind of closed as well, don't they, the image, yeah. And I think one lovely thing about the image, let's just share it again while I have the chat there. Where's how do I bring up the chat? Here we go. You can keep writing in the chat if you want. There's something about it. It's an image that a painter in England has painted. He's an order member in our community. The bottom bit is like three-dimensional kind of grass stuck on. Cardboard painted grass, and as you go up along the painting, it becomes more and more kind of esoteric and refined until, you know, the aura around his head is really quite transcendental and really quite out there, and that represents the kind of the multidimensional nature of consciousness in its fullest potential. You know, we narrow and limit the mind so much, but actually the mind is incredible. Yeah, so and multifaceted. So Laura is saying, we noticed that this image of the Buddha was kind of a non-binary. Yeah, so a lot of Buddhist images are quite androgynous, actually, representing that we go beyond all dualities, including gender, attachment to being in a certain kind of way. It's not that physically the Buddha's body changed, but it's more that we don't identify with anything, actually, and we can just identify, and then we can empathize with everyone, you know? The halo was cosmic, the gold surrounding maybe emerging of the inner with the outer world. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Laura. And so much compassion and strength and beauty and truth. Magella, calmness, peace and serenity. Yeah. So Tony's just shared that image if you want to buy it. Under normal conditions, I think they'll post it out to you within a few days. And you can buy it in A4, A5, and A4, A3, and A5, A4, and A3. So A4 is a normal page size. So I'd recommend at least getting A4, if not A3, which is bigger again. But you can get it in A5, which is half a normal page. Anyways, I'm not trying to be selling you stuff, but just if you wanted, it is nice to have a good image, and there's lots of other images there as well on that bookshop. Okay, so we're nearly out of time. So okay, sorry, let me just send a quick message. Okay, so in terms of the home practice this week, let me just share the screen again. So what I want you to do for the coming week, I want you to read chapter 6 of the book. Let me just check that that's the right chapter, actually. Hang on a second. Yes, read chapter 6 of the book. You could, let's see. You could also read chapter 7, actually, because next week we'll be going on to chapter 8. But chapter 6 is the main text of what this week's material is about. And then what I'd like you to do is keep looking at your practice of precepts over the coming week. And there's a few things here now, but it's simpler than it sounds. Just reflect, how do you respond when you fall short or when you let yourself down? Yeah. And make sure that you're able to clarify between unhelpful guilt on the one hand and helpful remorse on the other, or Hri and Apatrāpya. You might not be able to tell the difference between Hri and Apatrāpya, but it might just be you can recognize healthy remorse. Yeah, apologize if necessary, forgive if you can, make amends obviously too, and so on. Yeah, and then you might also just make sure to reflect upon the positivity represented by the Buddha. So if you want to, just, well, what would it be like to be free of this tendency that you have? That's another way of reflecting on the Buddha. This deep-rooted envy that you experience. Envy is a really horrible emotion to have to admit to having. It's one of the hardest ones to admit to, I think. What would it be like to be free of this? That's kind of reflecting on the qualities of the Buddha, you could say. So record how you get on with all these in your notebook. I don't have it here, but I would also really encourage you to keep doing your gratitude practice as well, writing in your gratitude things into your book. So read the book, Svadharani's book, keep looking at your practice of the precepts and clarifying what you do when you fall short, look for remorse rather than guilt, do what you need to do then in terms of making amends, and stay in touch with the positive, and do your gratitude journal. So I hope that's all clear. And don't forget, if you want to donate, the link is dublinbuddhistcentre.org/donate. Yeah? And if you want to click on that from the chat earlier, you can leave it open in the background to do it after we finish in a few minutes. Okay. There was something else I was going to say there. What was it? The other thing that I'd like you to do is, for next week's class, next week being the last week of the course, I'd like you to bring a card that you'll be sending to yourself. Okay, so I'd like you to bring a postal card, like a card with an envelope and something nice, something nice, like a nice card that you have, that you like, not a happy 40th birthday or whatever, but a card that is nice. If you can pick one up during the week, if you can, and we're going to use that next week. Normally, what I do is I collect them and post them to you a month after the course. But that's not going to work in this COVID world. So I'll remind you in the email as well to do this, to bring a card for next week. I'm going to take a note of that. So someone has asked, what does it mean by reflecting on the Buddha's positivity? So it can be reflecting on the Buddha himself, like I just mentioned, or what. But I think a lot of it would be like the fact that one can become free of these tendencies that we're experiencing. That is reflecting on the Buddha's qualities. Or what would it be like to feel generosity all the time? What would it be like to feel love all the time? That kind of thing. And not in a way of making ourselves feel worse, but just dwelling that that is possible. Okay, it's 9 o'clock. We're out of time. I'll email you the resources and the reminders for the home practice. I'll probably send it first thing in the morning, as I've usually been doing. Tony, can you make me the host again? The main host? Just give us 1 second. When that great, that's come true. So I'm just going to stop the recording now and stop the live stream.